Well, thank you very much, Branwyn. I've given myself quite a big topic here, the future of education. And when I tried out my speech last week, it took more like 45 minutes than the 20 minutes that I've actually got. So I've decided to narrow down what I'm going to do quite significantly, even relative to the whole of education, but also relative to some of the things that we do at the IFS. So, for example, I'm not going to say anything about early years education, incredibly important though that is, and actually the focus of a lot of the work that my colleagues are doing. And as you'll see, there's an awful lot of other things I won't talk about in the speech, but I'm sure we'll come to in the discussion. What I want to do is really focus the talk around a puzzle. And the puzzle starts off like this. The amount of education, the number of people with high levels of qualifications, has been growing really quite fast over the last few decades. This is showing you the fraction of people in their late 20s, first of all born in the late 1960s, so that's my cohort, and indeed the IFS's, what proportion of them had at least A-level or A-level equivalent by the time they were in the late 20s, and you can see that about a third did. By the time you get to the group born in the early 90s, that had doubled. So 2/3 of people born in the early 90s had got to A-level standard, level 3 in education speak, by the time they got to their late 20s. So that's a doubling. If you look at those with degrees by the time they're in the late 20s, you actually see it's tripled, more than tripled, from about 12% to 40%. So of those born in the early 90s, about 40% have been through university and got a degree. If you look at postgraduate qualifications, well, that's more like quintupled from about 2% to 10% over that period. So the number of people, young people particularly, with very high levels, relatively high levels of education, has grown very dramatically over the past couple, 3 or 4 decades. And yet, just last week, and this I could have chosen almost any week, but just last week, we had the Industrial Strategy Council, which is the government's advisor on competitiveness and productivity, chaired by Andy Haldane, Deputy Governor of the Bank of England, bring out a report saying that productivity in the UK is held back by significant skills gaps, that 28% of workers are underqualified for the job that they have, increasing gaps in digital skills as well as management communication and analytical skills, and half of adults have only primary school numeracy levels. So you've got all of that big increase in qualifications, and yet you've got this puzzle. And big part of the puzzle here, we talk about the productivity puzzle. Productivity has flatlined over the last decade as the number of people with high levels of qualifications and education has risen. Let me just say something particularly about these numeracy and literacy skills. The next chart is probably the most messy that I'm going to bring up, but I think it's quite an important one. So I told you it was messy. This is looking at literacy, though it will also be true of numeracy skills, across a number of OECD countries and by generation. So the bright green squares are showing average scores in literacy among an older group, 55 to 65, and you can see that England's doing fairly well there. The blue square is up the distribution. The diamonds are showing the average scores for younger people, those in their early 20s. You'll see for every country bar one, younger people are cleverer than older people, or at least more literate. The one that stands out is England. Despite all of that extra education, there's been no progress over those generations in terms of literacy skills. We see that if you look at levels of basic numeracy and basic literacy, we have relatively high levels of problems among our younger adults compared with a lot of other countries. So we have all of those. We have the first chart I showed you, lots of additional education, and then whether you believe these particular numbers or not, I don't think there's too much doubt that we do have a series of problems with skills in this country. So why is that? Well, let's start by looking at what happens to young people after they finish at school. So this is taking a cohort of young people who did their GCSEs in 2003. This is one piece of work that is not an IFS piece of work. This is from the Centre for Vocational Educational Research at the LSE. What they've done is followed people through from age 16. So about half, just under half, have got GCSEs, 5 good GCSEs at that point, just over half don't. You move on to 18, what's going on there? Well, you can see that quite a lot of those GCSEs have translated into A-levels. A rather small number have translated into what's called their level 3 vocational. In education speak, level 3 is A-level equivalent. And still quite a lot have got either only GCSEs or below, but you can see some movement away from those who have nothing. Move on to age 22. Level 6 in education speak is a degree. So we've got about a quarter, getting on for 30% have translated their A-levels into a degree. But look at the bottom group, you've still got 40% who've got nothing better than GCSEs and a quarter who have got essentially nothing. Move that on a bit further, and nothing's happened at the bottom. You've got essentially no progress among those who by 22 were only at GCSE level or below. You'll also see that a relatively small number, only about 15%, have got a vocational qualification at level 3 at A-level equivalent, much lower than you'll find in most of our competitor European countries. You've got quite a lot with degrees, about a third have got a degree by that point. And then you'll see that almost, maybe you won't see it, almost invisible sliver of grey. Well, you'll notice that A-level is at level 3 and the degree is at level 6. What about levels 4 and 5? Well, one of the problems with our system is we pretty much don't have these intermediate technical qualifications in this country. One of the big things that the Auger Review brought up back in the summer, everything in the system is designed to provide institutions with incentives to provide a full 3-year degree if they're a university. FE colleges have been very significantly underfunded over recent decades. We have very little in that intermediate part. So 3 big messages from this chart. First, if you get to 16, and certainly if you get to 18 with GCSEs or below, you're probably not going to make progress after that. That's a real problem. Secondly, we've got relatively few going on to vocational qualifications. There's a big slew going through A-levels and degrees, but relatively few through vocational qualifications, and almost none getting those higher level technical qualifications. 3 big problems and 3 things I think closely related to the issue that I just raised. We also, although politicians of course talk about a ladder of opportunities through the education system, in reality we shut doors. Part of what you saw there was that it's very difficult for those who haven't done well by 16 to make good choices. The choices that are there are complex and they're limited. And the next figures I'm going to show you, again, come from the Centre for Vocational Educational Research at the LSE, and it's a very specific thing that they did. I think it's very nice and very clever and very illustrative of this problem. So what they did was looked at what happens to young people who just miss out on a C grade at GCSE English. And I don't mean the difference between a D and a C, I mean a 1-mark difference out of hundreds. So these young people are probably almost identical in their underlying ability and so on. And what happens to you if you miss out by 1 exam by 1 grade? A huge amount happens. You significantly reduce your probability of enrolling in A-levels or other higher qualifications by 9 percentage points. That's a big change. Same effect on actually achieving at that level. And actually a 4 percentage point increase in the probability of not being in education at all by the time you're 18. Given that only about 12 or 15% are in that position, a 4 percentage point difference is really big. So that's just illustrative of how difficult it is to pick yourself up if you mess up or if you're unlucky or if you don't do quite so well at one particular point in the system. For some, doors shut early on. So this is looking at, again, looking at the 5 good GCSEs outcome, including English and maths this time. If you're doing above expected at age 11, you're pretty much guaranteed to get your 5 GCSEs. So if you get your level 5s, which is above the expected level at age 11, you're going to go through and get your GCSEs. If you get to the expected level in both, you've got a good shot. If you get below the expected level in both, you've got no shot at all. You've essentially got probability 1 of failing the only thing that's available for you to pass or to get to, which is 5 good GCSEs. And we don't have a system which actually allows any valuable different route through from age 11. And yet we know, as I say, with pretty much probability 1, that if you haven't succeeded at age 11, you're not going to succeed later on. And of course, that translates into some of those basic skills problems that I described earlier. And of course, who are the people who are not doing so well? Well, overwhelmingly, they're those from poorer backgrounds, from lower socioeconomic classes. I could have chosen one of 1,000 charts to show you that there's a huge difference between those from higher and lower socioeconomic groups. I'm choosing something that my colleagues Claire Crawford and Ellen Greaves did a couple of years ago, looking at the probability of getting to higher education according to your social background. So what this is showing you is that those from the lowest socioeconomic groups, about 20% get on into higher education. That small dark bar is the percentage you get into a high status one. Those are the ones with which require the highest A-level grades. It's not quite the same as the Russell group, but think of it as the Russell group institution. So about 20% get in, about 2 or 3% get into these high status institutions from the lowest social group. What about from higher groups? Well, as you'd probably expect, the probability is higher for those from higher groups. Now, several things to take from this. This is not just a difference between the rich and the rest, and it's not just a difference between the poor and the rest. Like many things, it's socially graded. Each point you move up the social class spectrum, the higher your probability of success. You see exactly the same kind of pattern if you're looking at health outcomes, mortality, all of these things. They're socially graded. Secondly, in terms of getting into higher education, you've got 3 times the probability if you're from the highest group than if you're from the lowest group. And that gap has actually closed somewhat over time as more people from lower social backgrounds have gone into higher education. But look at those high status institutions, the ones where you can really go on into the high paid jobs. That's a 10 times difference between the top group and the bottom group in terms of probability of getting there. Now, this isn't because universities are in some sense discriminating against those from poorer backgrounds. Pretty much all of this is determined by the time you've done your GCSEs. Almost absolutely all of it is determined by A-level results. Half of it is determined at age 11. So half of that gap you can completely explain by how well young people are doing at age 11. So I'm not complaining at the way that higher education institutions are selecting their students, but this is just an illustration of the gaps that our system lives with. And this matters. So what happens in the labour market to those people who haven't got very much in the way of education if they've got GCSEs or below? Well, that's the average, or the median, in fact, hourly earnings over time. It's a bit less than £10 an hour. A bit more, but not much more than the minimum wage. And that's the median for the lower educated group by the time they're in their late 20s and early 30s. That's a pretty poor outcome, illustrating the relative lack of employable skills that these people have. And there's a big gap between that line and having a degree. You do a lot better, as you'd expect if you've got a degree. And the gap between those lines is pretty much held up over time, despite the fact there are a lot more people with degrees. So it matters a lot. And it matters, so this is for people in the late 20s and early 30s. I think one of the crucial things, what these 2 charts are showing, is that it matters more over time. So look at the left-hand chart. That's showing you what happens to wages over time as men and women age if they've only got GCSEs. You can see the lower line for women is incredibly flat. I mean, essentially wages rise to about age 25, and then they flatline at not much different to the minimum wage rate. For men, it goes up a bit more, but it still flattens off relatively early. If you've got a degree, they rise much more quickly. Flatten off earlier for women, and that's really very much associated with childbirth. But the key point here is that education breeds not just a better start in the labour market, but even more importantly, much better progress in the labour market. And who gets training in the labour market? Those who already have education. Education breeds education and training. Those who enter the labour market with relatively low skills get very little additional training whilst they're there. Now, up till now, in a sense, I've been speaking as if getting into university is almost the be-all and end-all, and that gives you success, and all is well when you get there. But no, look at that graduate earnings line again. Average hourly earnings among graduates in their late 20s today are no higher than they were a quarter of a century ago. Now, part of that is a compositional effect. There are more graduates. They're being drawn, presumably, from a slightly less skilled part of the potential market. But you would expect that an effective education system, an effective higher education system that was providing the sorts of skills that the labour market is really demanding would see those salaries rise over time. And you can see actually since the financial crisis they've come down somewhat. So you've got stagnant earnings. Why have you got stagnant earnings? Well, it's partly to do with the fact that where the degree that you do makes a big difference to the earnings that you end up with, and we have a lot of people doing degrees which don't appear to provide very much in the way of higher returns. And I'm not saying that the only thing that matters about education or the only thing that matters about higher education is what you earn, but it's clearly an important element. So this is, Brangwyn was referring to the LEO data, the longitudinal educational outcomes data earlier. This is using that data. Colleagues of mine done an enormous amount of work with this data. And this is showing for men what are the returns to the best that we can estimate it from going into for doing different degrees. And it's saying that if you're wise, like some of us were, and do economics, then you earn quite a lot more. Maybe not so wise to go to the IFS, but anyway. Medicine, as you'd expect, business, law, engineering, computing, you earn quite a lot more than you would do if you hadn't gone through the university system. But on the other end of the scale, there's actually quite a lot of subjects where, as best we can make out, you actually earn less as a result of doing that degree than you would have done had you gone straight into the labour market. The key point here is that you don't get much in the way of economic returns from quite a range of degrees, and those are quite big degrees. Lots of people do creative arts and English and so on. I should say the picture looks a bit different for women. There's more consistent benefits to higher education for women, partly because less well-educated women do so badly in the labour market that the returns to higher education are higher. So returns to degrees are hugely variable by subject. But what our funding system does is effectively give bigger government subsidies to those subjects where people do less well, because of course the amount you pay back depends on your earnings. Most graduates won't pay back all that they borrow in order to pay for their degrees. And who are the ones who are going to earn least? Well, they're the ones on the left-hand side, the ones who are getting least. So for example, we spend about 1.2 billion a year of government money funding about 37,000 creative arts students. We spend about £500 million a year funding 19,000 engineering students. The amount per student is a lot less for the engineering students than the creative arts students, despite the fact that it costs more. I mean, an engineering degree costs more to provide. Now, is that the right way of spending government money? I don't know. Is it the intention of the system? I don't think it was. I don't think anyone sat down and thought, well, let's spend 1.2 billion a year on 37,000 creative arts students and spend a rather less than half of that on 19,000 engineering students. And again, one of the conclusions, I think, from the Auger Review, or Philip Auger, I know, thought this was a pretty bizarre way of funding higher education. So part of the reason that you've got that flat lining of graduate returns, of graduate earnings, is that we have an awful lot of people doing degrees that really don't have very much value at all in the labour market. And just to add to that, I said, it's not the case that simply getting to university sorts everything out. What is this saying? Well, this is saying that those graduates from about the top 25 or 30% of households in terms of their parental income earn on average, the men, about nearly 25% more than graduates from the bottom three-quarters of the income distribution. Women, a similar amount, maybe 17% more. Now, that's not surprising. You saw that people from those social groups are more likely to go to the Russell Group universities. They've probably got better A-levels and so on average from those from lower social groups. So what we, or rather my colleagues, have done is look at what happens to that if you control for the university that someone went to, the course that they studied. Now, you would expect, I think, that if a group of people study the same subject at the same university, they all on average to get the same earnings at the end, but no. what this is essentially saying is if you're from a higher social group and you go to the same university, you study the same subject as someone from the bottom 75%, these are big groups. This isn't the sort of top against the bottom. This is the sort of top 25, 30% against the rest. They still earn more than 10% more 10 years into their jobs. And that gap probably grows further through time. So universities are not closing that social gap, and they're probably not inculcating some of the skills that some of these young people are going to need. So where does that leave us? I just want to draw out from that very swift run through some very particular issues, some potential lessons for the future. I think one is an important point actually for governments. Just getting more and more people through qualifications isn't enough. We saw this particularly under the last Labour government with targets for all sorts of outcomes in terms of qualifications. This government's got targets for the number of people going through apprenticeships. We should not be focusing just on numbers going through qualifications. That's not what gets people the skills that they need. Terribly important to have better routes for those not getting 5 good GCSEs. It's incredibly hard for those young people to navigate their way through the school and further education system post-16, and a lot of them don't navigate themselves very far, and they don't navigate themselves to particularly good literacy and numeracy skills. Absolutely crucial in terms of closing those skills gaps that I opened with. Lots and lots of people go through the A-level and university route. We've got more young people going to university than virtually any other country, in fact. Other routes exist. Other routes should be taken much more seriously. We need a framework for levels 4 and 5, a funding framework, some incentives for people to do that. We know that these are valuable skills. We know that they are rewarded in the labour market. We know that other countries do a lot more of this, and yet we provide a framework for funding which makes it almost impossible for institutions to make these available to very many young people. Probably most importantly here is clarity and stability for the vocational route. Now, one thing I haven't said very much about is current government policy. A lot of current government policy in principle makes some sense. We're seeing so-called T-levels coming in next year, which is a vocational equivalent or technical equivalent to A-levels, or supposed to be. A lot of the reforms that are happening to apprenticeship make a good deal of sense. The problem, in a sense, is this is the second or third or fourth iteration of the same effort by generations of governments, and we have no stability in that system. We have very little clarity about it. Contrast that with what's happening with GCSEs and A-levels. These are recognizably the same things as existed in the 1940s. I mean, they've changed their name, but and I'm sure any teachers in the audience will think, what do you mean they're stable? They change every year, but they change within very narrow frameworks. People understand what these things are. They have a very clear brand. Arguably, they're too stable. Why do we have GCSEs? They were introduced originally because most young people left school at 16. This was a leaving certificate. Nearly everyone stays on post-16 at the moment, so why we have them? Actually, the only reason we have them is because we've always had them. A-levels, as we all know, are extremely narrow, so a very, very internationally curious system with not very obvious benefits. Universities are not the be-all and end-all. The fact that we've got getting towards 50% of young people going to university does not mean that all of those 50% of young people are doing the right thing, are being well trained for what really matters, are going to do well in the labour market. A lot of them aren't, and it's a very expensive way of achieving what we're currently achieving. So we don't just want to focus on that as an end. And then there's a whole lot of other things that I haven't mentioned, but I'm sure that Branwen will elicit that from Anna and David. Thank you.
Thank you.